Hello. We'll be waiting just another couple minutes here to get started, just giving some other folks some time to hop on the broadcast here. So thank you for your patience. Hello, and welcome to Building Digital Trust in 2019, Security, Accessibility, and Privacy. My name is Eric Wagner, and I'll be helping to moderate this webinar. Over the course of the webinar, please enter your questions into the GoToWebinar platform. We'll be answering all questions at the end of the webinar. So today's webinar will be led by Samantha Schreiber and Kevin Rydberg of Siteimprove. Today's webinar will focus on compliance. Oftentimes, compliance is an afterthought that digital strategists spend little time thinking about. While topics like security, accessibility, and privacy might not be as sexy as digital transformation, we believe that they are extremely important and should be a core component to your digital strategy. So why compliance? It's not just about avoiding big lawsuits, it's about doing the right thing and caring equally for the user experience of all of your users. But before we jump into the content, let's do a quick bit of housekeeping here. So last week we hosted our first webinar in the series. It was called 2019 Digital Differentiators, Content Strategy, UX, and Personalization. If you missed our webinar last week, we strongly recommend checking it out. There's a link in this slide here that you can follow, the bit.ly, and that will lead you right to the webinar there. A little bit of background about FFW. We're a global digital agency with European headquarters in Copenhagen and US headquarters in New Jersey. We provide a range of strategy, UX, design, development services for some of the largest companies in the world. We've been in business for over 18 years and delivered over 2,000 solutions for over 500 clients. Siteimprove offers some of the most comprehensive digital presence optimization software. This software is used to create higher quality content, drive better traffic, measure performance, and more. Siteimprove has over 7,000 customers and has been in business since 2003. All right, well, with that, let's jump into the content. Sam, I'll let you take it away from here.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you are not in the central time zone of the U.S. like I am. So just to kick this off, we wanted to take a moment to kind of pause before we really dig into the different compliance aspects to kind of talk around the central thesis of this topic, as Eric was mentioning earlier, which is what we're really talking about today is building trust with your customers or your consumers or your site visitors, rather than focusing on checking off items in a compliance checklist. And really, if you boil it all down, what that really means is that you can do this, you can achieve this through one simple action, which is by making your business decisions like you are a consumer yourself. And pretty much any organization in the world is comprised of humans who also do business with similar organizations in their own personal lives. And I think a big part of what gets lost in the compliance conversation is the fact that decision makers are human beings who also consume in their own ways. And so when we're talking about compliance, things like security and privacy and accessibility and all these things that make people cringe, what we're really talking about is enabling users to have trust in an organization such that they can do business with them or they're comfortable doing business with them. And again, not to belabor the point, thinking of yourself as one of those people really helps you to connect with the spirit of the laws or regulations that are kind of governing your policy decisions and your business decisions, rather than falling back on, do you technically check off this box? So when we're talking about compliance, it's a very general term that typically is tied to a law or a bill or a regulation in a various state or country level. And we're seeing more and more, especially as technology has kind of exploded, that those laws and regulations are tending to be more and more focused on user rights and helping businesses to make decisions on user rights. And so just a few examples that we have here, and we will dig into a few of these things specifically a little bit later on, but when we're talking about, for instance, the General Data Protection Regulation, Eric, if you don't mind jumping forward, this is just a listing, and I'm not going to go through all this in great detail at this moment, but this is a listing of one of the foundational pieces of the GDPR, which is the list of consumer rights. It forces businesses who do business in the EU with EU citizens to acknowledge these rights of those citizens and to address them in their digital businesses. Similarly, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which we'll talk about more in a bit, does the same thing for California residents, making sure that Californians' rights are respected and protected in the state of California. And then, Kevin, I believe that we want to talk a little bit as well about accessibility. And although the laws and regulations governing accessibility are much older than those related to digital privacy, they are also founded in this rights-based experience.
Yeah, you're correct, Sam. I'm going to focus just really on the U.S. Rules today. We're not going to get into things like the EU directive or AODA up in Canada, but what we wanted to do is, again, let's focus on your rights as a consumer. And so you'll see that in the States, we go back all the way to the Rehab Act of 1973 with Section 504. Now, what's critical to note here is that this is a civil rights issue. Of all of the things that you would not expect the web to be about, but the web is about civil rights if you don't have equal access. So the basis is really Section 504 versus Section 508, which is what you probably typically associate with accessibility rules. And remember that it is an anti-discrimination civil rights statute, and it did set the precedent. It set the baseline for ADA. And to transition into ADA, of course, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And this is where enforcement seems to be coming from if there are any lawsuits or complaints that are happening right now. There's a couple other terms to be aware of, Title II and Title III. In most cases, if there is an issue, you're going to hear about it under Title III, which is public accommodation. Again, this is a civil rights issue. This is not about the technology, but it's about a person's right to have access. A key piece of 1990 ADA as well is that employers need to provide reasonable accommodations. So that means as an employee, your employer is required to provide you the correct tools and work environment that you need as well.
And
back to you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks. And one thing to note, Eric had mentioned that we talked about, digital differentiators last week and how to really set yourself apart through really understanding your users and creating experiences that are great for your users. And, often the reason why we wanted to do this follow-on webinar is that often compliance gets left out of that conversation, as Eric mentioned. And really an outstanding customer experience honors these rights of consumers and allows them to have the trust in you that you're going to protect their privacy, protect their information, secure their information, and provide them an experience that is equitable, no matter their situation. So let's dig into privacy a little bit. Today we're going to focus on two of the more recent, I guess we can call them advances in the privacy conversation. That would be the General Data Protection Regulation that encompasses EU citizens, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, that is the state's, I guess, answer or follow-on or copying of the GDPR. And really, the reason that we wanted to talk about these, A, they've garnered a lot of news, and I think a lot of people have questions about them in the past year or two. But B, they've really tried to address the big gap when it comes to privacy protection in the way that businesses used to do business and the way that businesses are doing business in a digital world. So they've really expanded the definition of what personal data means. And if you take nothing else away from this webinar today, although Kevin may disagree with this nothing else issue, I would say that it's rethinking the definition of what personal information is. In previous years and in olden times, oftentimes we thought of personal information, or PII as we often would throw around, as information that was highly specific and very kind of protected in our minds. So things like social security numbers, things like birth dates, things like maybe physical addresses. What the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act is, what they do is they acknowledge that in a digital world, so much more than just those highly specific things identify you and allow others to identify you. So under the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act, your name is personal data, your username, which may even just be random numbers and letters, is personal data, your IP address is personal data, anything that a person can use to identify you as a user and tie your actions to digital information, all of that counts as personal data. And that's a big shift from the way we used to think about protecting quote unquote PII and the level at which we would need to be concerned with people's privacy, right? It had to basically be something that people could carry over and steal your identity with in order for people to care about protecting it. And now under the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act, if it identifies you at all, you have to care about it. And the other thing that makes these two policies or these two regulations noteworthy is that they both carry fines and can be used to enact punishments upon businesses that choose to ignore the regulations. So with the GDPR, you're looking at the potential for up to 4% of your global turnover for the year, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. for your largest or most severe infringement. So let's say you've violated the regulation in 3 different ways. The most severe one is the one that you'll be fined for. And if it's super severe, you could be fined for whatever is largest of 4% of your annual turnover, or 20 million euro. In California, they're taking a different approach. There are flat fines of 7,500 US dollars, but that is for each fine. So if in that instance you had 3 violations, you would be fined 7,500 per violation. So with the fines being a scary kind of stick that these regulations can wield, and the broader definition of what personal data really is, it's got a lot of people talking, and we really wanted to focus on these 2 and dig into them a little bit today. What I will say is we have a few items for how you can get started, but it is going to scratch the itch. There is a plethora of information out there. FFW, in fact, has a whole kind of branch of GDPR consulting that we do that really digs into this stuff, but we wanted to give you some sense of where you could get started. So, of course, the very first thing is just to understand what are the regulations that may apply to you. In this instance, again, we're just going to look specifically at GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act, but there may be other, federally based or otherwise regulations that may apply. So looking at GDPR, what we're talking about here, and this is why, again, it made news and was scary, is that it's organizations located within the EU who are obligated to comply, but also organizations located outside of the EU if they offer goods or services or monitor the behavior of EU citizens. So that's where a lot of folks in the US and other places abroad got really nervous that, oh, we have EU citizens who may be doing business with us. Great, now we have to comply with this new regulation. And really what they're talking about is if you have a specific marketing aim or business goal to do business with EU citizens, in that case, if you know they're a big part of your market share and that's a part of your business model, in that case, the GDPR applies. If a random EU citizen finds your website on the internet and you in no way intend for EU citizens to be taking part in your goods or services, you are safe, at least for now. But I just wanted to be clear about kind of where those lines fell. For the California Consumer Privacy Act, what we're really talking about here is very specific. The California statute kind of got very granular as opposed to EU's more broader definition. So they're looking at $50 million a year in revenue. They're looking at people who sell or use information of more than 100,000 consumers or their devices, and that you derive a large portion of your revenue from selling that information. So they're very specific about where this law applies. There was a lot of talk about this law being just the first step of many, and that it was kind of the compromise that allowed a law like this to get put on the books. I would not be surprised to see this law evolve or to see other laws like it start to crop up across the US. So once you've understood what laws apply to you or regulations, and you kind of have a sense of the game, well, where do you go from there? We have kind of a very specific regimen at FFW that has been very helpful. And basically what it comes down to is after you understand what laws apply, you really need to do a thorough assessment or evaluation of your business to understand how you comply and how you don't comply. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we make so many minute business decisions kind of for every instance and every use case and every user that we start to lose the thread a little bit. And sitting down to document what are all the ways in which you can, what are all of the types of personal data you collect, first of all? What are you doing with it? Where is it going? How is it being manipulated or changed, or in the case of California, very specifically sold? What is your reason, or in the jargon of GDPR, lawful basis for collecting and doing anything with that data? And if you're using consent as your reason, if you're saying, well, people gave me this information because they wanted something from me, which is perfectly reasonable, how are you collecting that consent? And how are you managing if someone later says, okay, I gave you my consent, but now I want to take it back? We found as we go through this exercise with a lot of our customers, there's some pretty big holes where people don't realize how much a particular campaign or a particular business unit has really kind of gone off on their own and started to collect a lot of information. And especially as we talk about things like personalization, which we did last week in our webinar, the collection and storage of data has gotten a little bit insane, if you will, in the sense that digital file cabinets of user data have started to just crop up. And I've actually had clients do these GDPR-based sessions. Well, we keep it, just in case we need it. And under both the California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR, that is super not allowed. You cannot just keep information about people because maybe someday you'll want to do something with it. So really understanding what you're doing is the very first step. So then from there, of course, just like anything else, you're going to want to start identifying those gaps in, okay, if this is what we're collecting and here's what the law says, where are the two not aligning? If we're collecting this type of data and the law says once we collect that type of data, we need to do X, are we doing X, yes or no? Start to create that list of gaps to make sure that you're filling out your kind of roadmap for compliance. After you do that, you can start to prioritize things based off of resources, budget, timing, et cetera, and so forth, and be able to kind of create a plan that will allow you to become compliant with the regulations or laws that apply to you. And then, of course, you'll want to update your tools or your business processes in that prioritized order. Now, our last point in getting started is almost the most important point, and in fact, it is written into the GDPR as part of compliance and being compliant. Please, 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 as you're going through this process, create a paper trail and keep all of your documentation. Everything from meeting notes where you first sit down as a marketing team and say, okay, we figured out GDPR applies to us. What the heck are we doing? Keep that stuff, because what it helps to do is A, keep you organized, but B, it helps to demonstrate that you're taking privacy seriously. It helps to ensure auditors or folks who might be investigating any complaints against you that your intentions were pure and that you were trying to do the right thing. Even if you take a misstep, in a lot of cases showing that your intention was to do the right thing, and because you have your rationale and all of your documentation out there, if you should have done X, but instead you did Y, it will show that there was a thought process there and that there was an intention there. And that can help in, especially with the GDPR, those tiered fines, identifying the type of fine or penalty that may be enacted on your business. So keep all of your records, keep your to-do lists, keep track of your progress against them, and then you're going to want to update your privacy policy or privacy policies to reflect your new awareness of what you're doing with data and share the information that you have in your documentation with your consumers. That transparency is a huge part of both the California Consumer Privacy Act and the GDPR, to such an extent that both have very explicit directives to update your privacy policy and include certain information. And then you're also going to want to make sure that internally, and again with both of those acts, it is part of the requirement, to make sure that your team internally is trained and or informed, depending on the level of severity and their role, about your privacy policies and your privacy mitigation plans and things like that. So making sure that privacy becomes part of everyone at your organization's concern is foundational to being compliant with these laws. And then, of course, that leads into, training materials may be necessary for folks with data entry capacities or folks who manage data to make sure that they understand what they should and should not be doing with this data and what you've told users you're going to do and what you're not going to do. So that was a lot, but also very, very little. So we have a couple of resources here that are a really great start for you if you want to dig in and understand these things. We have some resources that FFW has collected from our white papers and other webinars specifically about GDPR. The UK's ICO website actually is a really great resource that's really well organized and kind of takes you step by step through the process. Siteimprove has GDPR related tools and information to help. So all of that kind of encompasses the GDPR. Because the Consumer Privacy Act has not yet gone into effect, it goes into effect January 2020. There's still a little bit of a lack of resources when it comes to that. So for now, I would direct you just to their website to understand, where things stand today and how things might be progressing as we approach that 2020 implementation deadline. So with all that said, we're going to leave privacy behind and jump into security. Now, similar to privacy, where depending on the type of organization you may be affected by different regulations or laws, security is even more so. But what I will say is both the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act, again, have explicit direction that you must secure, and that part of your duty to protect consumer privacy is to secure their information. So security is a huge part of it, but because it's so nuanced and based off of the particular information you need to protect and the type of system you have the information in, there's not a lot of really explicit security information out there. So what I thought we would do is just kind of demonstrate for you or show you FFW's top 10, if you will. We'll get a little BuzzFeed listicle going, and just walk through, if you had to start somewhere, not knowing your specific system and not knowing your specific needs, where could you maybe start? If you want to really validate that you have good security in place, or if you're getting started, kind of evaluating everything and making changes, this is where we'd recommend. So first and foremost, HTTPS everywhere. I don't even know how to dig into that one more because it's just so fundamental to how digital interactions are done today. If you don't have an HTTPS protected website, consumers have very little faith in your website. They may not even go to your website, and they certainly aren't going to want to do anything transactional with you. In addition to the fact that browsers now are warning users against visiting these websites and making it even more difficult for them to visit them. So I'll kind of leave that there. The second and third recommendations we feel very strongly about at FFW, mostly because folks tend to want to ignore them, which is requiring separate user accounts for all of your users. Please never ever allow users to share one account. For both privacy regulation reasons and just general security, it is a terrible idea. And similarly, enforcing strong password policies is a huge component that a lot of people often want to fight. We don't want to have to think of long, complex passwords with multiple characters and numbers and all that craziness in them, but it makes our data safe and it makes our system safe, and it is a huge part of any strong security program. You also want to make sure that, although we never recommend overly complex systems with too many user roles, you definitely want to make sure there is tiered access, and you should not be allowing all of your users access to everything unless you have a very specific, very limited user group who has very high trust. It just never fits well if you have people who are only entering data at a simple level, also having access to user information and instances like that. Another piece of our top 5 is auditing to show who has accessed information, particularly private information or user information. A lot of times this auditing log gets lost. Most auditing will be done related to maybe server access or things that are more of a business risk to bringing the system down or something like that. But it is really important to make sure that you are aware which users are accessing your user information and when they're accessing that information in case of any sort of breach situation or anything of the like. For 6 through 10, these start to get a little bit more technical and a little bit more crazy. So I'll kind of sum them up in a little bit of plain language. But basically, you don't want to allow access to your data that is anonymous. It kind of goes along with that logging number 5, making sure that any systems that are connecting to your system or anyone who is connecting to your system is logged and known is huge. Making sure that you're encrypting data submissions, particularly forms that contain personal information. And again, remember, under GDPR and California privacy, personal information includes things like email and name. So all forms, basically, in the universe. And then making sure that you are obscuring or hashing, in the lingo, email and other personal data when you store it. So that's when you see asterisks for passwords, that type of thing, except not only on the front end, but also on the back end. A big piece that organizations often miss is you have multiple environments for doing your development and other types of development activities. So for instance, you'll have a development environment and your production one that's live and available to the public. Making sure that when you're taking your production data, your live data that you use, and pulling it down to your development environment when you want your developers to be able to do work, that process should include cleansing out data you don't need. You should not be giving your developers access to folks' personal data unless it is necessary. And in most cases, it is not, unless they're testing user account related activities and they need data. Most of the time it can be wiped and test data can be created. And then finally, using DDoS protection at the server level to make sure that everything is secured at that layer as well. So one note to leave you with at the security level, and I mentioned this when I was talking about our top 3 or our top number 2 and 3, don't allow ease of use arguments to compromise your security. A lot of times we don't want to inconvenience a user by forcing them to have a strong password or to change their password with any sense of regularity. We don't want to infringe upon their one-click process or things like that. There are ways through user experience and technology that you can make their journey and their transactions simpler and easier, but it should never come at the expense of security, most particularly when it comes to complying with some of these laws, because in the instance that you are breached, saying, well, we didn't want a user to have to remember a 15-character password, so we let them just do a 3-character password, is not going to help you out when the auditors or the inspectors come around to understand what happened with that breach. And with all that dire warning, let's turn it over to Kevin to talk about something a little bit happier, which is making everything accessible for everyone and giving everyone a great experience.
Thanks, Sam. That's a lot of good information to take in. And what's interesting is as we transition into the accessibility piece, how many of those very important points that you made about security actually carry over. And I'll start to show some comparisons here shortly. But let's go ahead and start out with our first question, and that is accessibility a requirement? And short answer is yes. And while it's very difficult to pin down the exact origins and and numbers as far as what's going on. We live in a very lawsuit-driven country here in the States, and this is, of course, where we're going to focus our attention today, but there's getting to be more and more issues globally as well. But let's focus on the U.S. And as far as accessibility being a requirement, just ask the thousands of businesses that are dealing with complaints and lawsuits. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, education, financial, private sector, large commerce sites, whatever the case may be. If somebody's come to your site and decided it's not accessible, they have probably filed a suit. And if they have filed that suit, it's going to get back to that same number that I talked about, or that same rule that I talked about earlier, and that is ADA Title III, which was originally based on Section 504. Now, just some stats for you here. This comes from ADA Title III website, which is one of the better resources for accessibility legal information. In 2017, there were 814 federal lawsuits filed. And in addition to that, there were 115 lawsuits filed in the state of California. We don't have the numbers for. I can tell you that the numbers have gone up significantly in 2018, even from 2017. So, yeah, whether you realize it or not, or whether we can put a actual legal number and regulation in place, accessibility is definitely a requirement. So more and more the legal side of things, the courts are siding on the side of persons with disabilities, and there is a lot of enforcement going on with the ADA Title III. Next slide becomes, how do I manage accessibility? And that's going to be the key question. And what I want you to think about from the compliance side of things versus the webinar that we did last week, where we talked about the user experience. Accessibility can be managed in a very similar way to a privacy program or a security program. You've got a model in place, you've got protocols, you've got rules, you've got people that have access and other people that don't have access. You really have a great model to build a solid accessibility compliance program. And when leadership understands that you can treat accessibility in a similar fashion, then it becomes a little easier for them to kind of understand how to prioritize, where to prioritize, and what's involved in putting a program like this together. So let's think about accessibility the same way that we would think about privacy or security, and that there are rules that need to be in place, and there are repercussions for not following those rules. So next slide, we're going to just kind of do a series of tips for helping you get started with accessibility. And some of these are compliance related, some of them are designer and user related, but they all roll together. And again, if you start to think about that security program that you've got in place, just be aware that it all comes down to the information that you have and the number of folks in your team and in the organization that understand why this becomes important. So first thing we want to remember with getting accessibility going is we need to understand our users. Who's coming to our site? What are they trying to accomplish? As a review from last webinar, 1 in 5 users may be dealing with a condition that makes your site difficult or even impossible to use. And we're not, again, focused on hearing or site issues nearly as much as we're thinking about things like mobility and cognitive issues, okay? There are other issues that we'll talk about here in a moment, but remember that that's a large group and there's a large spectrum of disabilities that need to be addressed. So one of the things you may want to consider is, as you're building out those personas in that rebuild process or that new project, don't forget that you can have persons with disabilities as part of your user persona. It just essentially takes the same person trying to accomplish the same task with an additional point or two of, hey, this person could only use a keyboard for this reason, whatever the case may be. If you want a little more information on using persons with disabilities in your personas, Whitney Quisenberry has developed a very excellent set of personas for usable UX. It's part of Rosenfeld Media's and her book, A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences, that was written by Whitney Quisenberry and Sarah Horton. There are some great examples available. Just go out and if you want to start by Googling accessible user personas, that will give you a really good indication of how that these particular personas were made up and written. And it's a pretty helpful way to think about your typical audience with one or two small but significant changes. Next slide. We need to really understand what we mean by accessibility. Okay, like we mentioned earlier, access to information has become a basic civil right. And in fact, there's more and more rules that are getting written in the EU and other places that really standardize the fact that this truly is a basic civil right. Okay, so remember that everyone should have access. Okay. Don't forget that scope of disabilities. Now, not everyone needs that assistive technology. You know, your site may work perfectly fine for the majority of the people. But when we, again, address that range of disabilities, we may be dealing with age-related disabilities, cultural. And if you remember when I talked about cultural, we used English as a second language. Temporary, maybe somebody is injured, they have their arm in a sling or a cast and they're unable to use the mouse like they normally do. Or even environmental, you're in an environment which is noisy, low lighting conditions, poor connection. There's just tons of things like that that can qualify as either permanent or temporary disabilities. So these are all things that you want to have a clear understanding of your users. How are they accessing your site? Are they sitting in that busy Starbucks coffee shop trying to manage their finances or whatever the case may be? So keep that in mind, that there are multiple conditions, and the better you understand what those conditions are and how your users are using the site, the better you'll be able to accommodate their needs. Next slide, please. We need a plan, just like everything. We just can't, shoot from the hip on accessibility. Just like we put together any kind of a major project, we want to have a comprehensive accessibility plan. And first and foremost, we really need top-down awareness, and that's from the CEO, the president, all the way down to the folks that are really managing the day-to-day content and accessing that site, doing the updates, news updates, etc. So everybody in the organization has their part to play, and we want to make sure that we address that within that plan so that there's good communication. Policies should be in place, and those policies need to have teeth. We can talk about accessibility policies all day long, but if they're just poo-pooed out of the way and not really paid attention to, and there's no repercussions for not following accessibility, we're not going to make any progress. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have organization-wide policies that can be acted on and that can be enforced. Okay, and then of course budget is a huge piece of that comprehensive plan. All right, we need to have a budget for the tools that we need, the training, time to build things correctly. We cannot let a timeline on a project dictate accessibility. Accessibility needs to be rolled in at every step along the way, and we need to make sure that when we have that timeline that we have allowed for the correct construction of those accessible pieces. Another big area of concern is what's already out there, whether it's an existing website, web app, the functionality that you have built into your tools, or even a lot of documents that may not have had accessibility considered when they were built. You're going to have to make sure within that budget that you're considering that. Do we start from scratch, or do we take the existing resources that we have and make them accessible? And I can do a half-day workshop on the pluses and minuses of remediation versus starting from scratch. So, there's lots of reasons. You have to figure out what's going to work best for you as an organization. Next. Organizational awareness is huge, and one of the things that I like to talk about is utilizing an action plan. That becomes part of that organizational awareness process. And within a typical SMART-based action plan, SMART standing for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. It's a fairly standard formula when building action plans. I like to start with these 7 categories: support, funding, strategic planning, communications, education, partnerships, and monitoring. And to dig a little deeper into each one of those, here's what I mean by each. You need to have an internal support system for managing the project. And within that, you need to declare objectives, who's responsible, how you're going to track progress, what resources are needed and where they're going to come from, then due dates and status, where are we at with this project, okay? Second is funding. We need to be sure that we have thought about labor. We need to think about agency support. We need to think about software, that training program that we talked about. Okay. Strategic planning. We need to guide the program's direction, goals, and strategies. So, what is the purpose of this? The purpose of this big project, this big process that we're implementing, and how is it important to the organization? And then within communications, you need to be able to communicate with your stakeholders and the public. So that means you're dealing with both internal communications among your team members as well as externally. One of the big pieces with external communications is putting together a comprehensive accessibility statement or policy that can be displayed publicly on the website. So there are different elements even within communications that need to be addressed. Now, within education, we can't continue to have success if we don't continue to educate our teams as we go. Not only do we need to get them up to speed with accessibility now, but as team members come and go, we need to make sure we have a comprehensive plan in place so that we are training our new people so that we don't either go backwards or stalemate out just because that have gained that knowledge have left, moved on, transferred to different departments, whatever the case may be. So we want to think about accessibility training. Of course, we want to think about standard website training. I mean, do we know basic HTML coding skills? Do we understand the design principles, things like that? Typically, what happens is we have people who are in administrative positions in other areas that all of a sudden website becomes other duties as assigned. Well, that's not fair because they've never had any specific training in most cases for managing a website. And there is more to it than simply logging in and copying and pasting. So we want to make sure that we are training our folks. Any other tools that you're using, whether it is tools like the Siteimprove tools or even document training tools like understanding how to make an Office document accessible and then convert it to a PDF. These are all important pieces of that education that need to happen so that we know that we're confident in the folks that are doing the work. And finally, partnerships. We want to address those. It could be internal partnerships like your IT or marketing team. It could be an external agency like FFW or Siteimprove, which is providing tools. It could be working with your CMS or other agencies that are there to help you with a new launch or a new product. So we need to be sure that we're working with competent partners and that they understand your accessibility needs and requirements for the project as well. And lastly, monitoring. This is where we really stress the fact that accessibility becomes a part of your organization's change management and process orientation. We don't call accessibility a project, one and done. We want to think about it as a process and how it becomes just a little additional piece of everything that gets done within the organization. It's just part of the process, okay? Then finally, think about the tools that you're using. Does your CMS allow you to enforce accessibility issues like putting correct alts on images? Are the forms built within the CMS so that they're accessible? How are we monitoring going forward? Do we have partners that we're relying on? We want to make sure that we have competent partners. And then don't forget the ongoing training and ongoing manual testing. Be sure to run through your site with keyboard only assistive technology if you're able to. If not, find a partner that can help you with that manual testing, because you're going to need to know what those results are that go well beyond just any of the automated or free tools that are out there. It's an ongoing process that needs to become part of your day-to-day work operations. Finally, we have one last step that I don't want to forget about on the next slide, which is documents. I mentioned it just a little bit ago, and just keep in mind that documents are a huge part of your online communications. Sometimes that's the way the information is provided is via a document that they download from your site. Well, you are liable for that information in that PDF or whatever in the same way that you're responsible for that web content. So it does become part of your overall content that needs to be accessible. Now, wherever possible, use HTML. It's easier to make accessible and easier to maintain as accessible, but that doesn't mean that you can't use PDFs, just you have to be thoughtful about them. Some areas where you can utilize PDFs are when you need a downloadable form that needs to hold its formatting in a particular way. Maybe it's a marketing document that's formatted to be printed, okay? It might be a document that provides more detail. We see catalogs and things like that that have, a lot more detail than what you can maintain on a website. And also low usage documents like those catalogs. Maybe I've got a 300-page catalog that gets updated every other year. That's a perfect example of where a PDF download may be very helpful. Another is archives. So keep the documents in mind. You're going to continue to use documents on your site. We don't want to discourage that, but we want to make sure that you understand how important they are to the overall content delivery and accessibility program that you're putting in place. And with that, I believe we're ready for a few questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sam. It does look like we had a few questions that came in. It looks like the first one is for Sam. Tim, can you tell us the difference between the California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR?
Sure. Well, besides the obvious that I talked about earlier, which is that GDPR applies to citizens of the EU and businesses who are courting them, and the California Consumer Privacy Act applies to businesses operating within California or doing business with California residents. That's a pretty big distinction. Another is the fines, which we talked about as well. But if you're really asking about the heart of the difference, it's really that GDPR is a massive regulation that evolved from other regulations that is trying to broadly address privacy rights for EU citizens and give businesses pretty far-reaching and broad compliance steps that they need to take to ensure that they're protecting consumer privacy. Versus the California Consumer Privacy Act is the first of its kind in California. It's one of the first, if not the first of its kind in the state. It's kind of built upon compromise, and it's very specific. It's very specific in which businesses it applies to, as I showed earlier, in terms of revenue and the types of businesses that you do. It's also very specific in the actions you need to take to comply. So very specifically, you need to have a toll-free number in your footer. Very specifically, you need to have a link that users can access that allows them to execute their rights. It has very specific rules around what California businesses and businesses working with California residents need to do, versus the GDPR is more of a heart and soul regulation that says you need to be doing the right thing, and because you're going to be so diverse, we're not going to specify the exact specific checklist that you need to follow, but we're going to say you need to be doing the right thing or else. So that's really the heart and soul difference between the two.
Excellent. And I had a couple of follow-up questions here specific to Google Analytics. For US-based companies with a customer base primarily in the US, does GDPR impact the use of Google Analytics?
So when you say primarily in the US, that leads me to believe secondarily, potentially in the EU, which means GDPR would apply. It does impact Google Analytics in the sense that Google Analytics becomes a processor of the personal data that you're collecting, and you need to be accounting for it in your evaluation and in your privacy policy. You need to be disclosing that you use Google Analytics and why you were using Google Analytics. But in terms of the data that it provides your business and the insights it provides your business to make decisions, it's perfectly allowable and perfectly suited to some of the, as they call it in GDPR, lawful basis for why you would be collecting information. The GDPR is not intending to restrict the data you collect and the ways that you, let's say, personalize the website based off that data. It's intending to force businesses to expose that they are doing that and to have a good reason for doing it. So like I said, your reason can't be, well, because we want to have it just in case we want to use it. That's not a good reason. But if your reason is because we want to understand which users are coming from where so that we can make decisions that help those users, that's a very good reason. So Google, in fact, I've seen several lawyers' blogs and resources that talk about Google, and Google is one of the very safe resources. Now, with that said, Google was recently fined, I want to say somewhere upwards of $40 million because of their own practices within the EU. So look at every business you're partnering with very carefully and keep apprised of what they're doing right or wrong with GDPR. But in terms of analytics, disclose and you should be good.
Okay. Did you have any thoughts on using the anonymous IP functionality within Google Analytics? Is that a requirement or a best practice?
It is not a requirement, but if you are tracking IP addresses, you have to have a reason, and you have to disclose that reason. Because IP addresses are personal data, once you collect it, you need to say why you're doing that and what you're doing it for. So if you do not need the IP address to still achieve your business goal, if you don't need to know the specific location that they are in, you just need to have generalized data so that you can make decisions, please do that because it saves you a lot of headache.
That makes sense. And Kevin, I think this one's for you. How much do I need to know about accessibility to use a tool like Siteimprove? I think you're muted.
You're right, I was muted. My apologies. That's a great question. Eric, how much do I need to know about accessibility for the Siteimprove tool is actually fairly minimal. You've got to have a little bit of a familiarity with what the rule set is, and in the case of the Siteimprove tool, it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, which is put out by the W3C. It's kind of the global standard at this point for digital accessibility. But you don't need to know a ton about that because the tool does a great job of directing you and showing you what the problem is, defining it, and then actually showing you on the page in the code. And then we link to a bunch of different resources so that you understand why it's a problem and then how to fix it. So working knowledge is great. It's going to really make you efficient, but you don't have to know a ton because it's going to walk you through each and every issue that we're able to detect.
Excellent. And if you were only to do one thing for accessibility on your website, where would you start?
Oh man, only one thing for accessibility. I think what I've pushed in the past and I'm going to stick with is understanding how to build a really good heading structure. Okay, and why a heading structure is important is it's really going to help you organize your information. It's going to help you organize that information so that an individual that may be coming to the site with the screen reader may actually browse that page by heading so they can figure out what they're looking for. And it's also going to help your readers that are visually looking at the site by breaking up that content and making it more usable. So again, think about somebody with dyslexia and only being able to focus on a small bit of content versus going through an entire page and trying to figure out what's important to them. So first and foremost, let's look at our heading structure for readability and also for scannability and also for assistive technology access.
Excellent. And I have one last question, very similar, and I guess I'll direct this one to Sam here. If there was only one thing you could do for privacy, what would you recommend?
Interesting. I would say a little bit of a cheaty answer. So that evaluation or auditing of your data, our clients are very often surprised by the gaps that they have. People think they know their content and their systems really well and that they understand what's happening with data. A lot of times there are gaps. So really taking the time to document out what are you doing with data, I would say is the most important thing. But of course, that doesn't then translate to any necessary changes anywhere. You just now have it all documented. So I would say my part two of the one thing would be to update your privacy policy. So at least if you can understand internally what you're doing, and then translate that into a public-facing documentation of it. Even if you make no changes, that's a pretty huge step toward doing right by your users in terms of their privacy.
Excellent. Well, with that, we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We will make sure that we post a recorded version of this webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to assist. Thank you so much.